Continuing in the middle of the second Aliyah, when Joseph's brothers saw him approaching, they plotted to kill him. Now, again, we just finished explaining that Joseph has brothers that are righteous. Jacob's bed is complete. He's not like Abraham, and he's not like Isaac that have other children that aren't necessarily righteous. Jacob, all of his children are righteous. They're all the progenitors of the tribes. How in the world can they be plotting to kill him? Eventually they don't kill him. But the reality is that even plotting to kill him is as if they are killing him. When we will read eventually when we get there, when Moses goes out and sees two men of the Jewish people fighting, right? This is when Moses is an adolescent or towards middle age. Back then, people lived for much longer. So he wants to see what's this situation with the Jews. Why are they imprisoned? Why are they enslaved here in Egypt? No other nation is entirely enslaved by Egypt or by any other nation. What's going on? And he sees one man hitting the other man. And he says, why are you striking your fellow? Lama sakereyecha. The reality, though, is that there was yet to be a strike. That perpetrator, that one who was about to hit the victim, was only raising his hand to hit him. He didn't yet hit him. And already Moses rightfully says, why are you hitting him? So even here, though they never actually end up killing him, they plot to do so. The plotting is as if they are killing him. How is that righteous? When we discussed earlier that whatever Joseph saw his brothers doing, that he would report to their father, to Jacob, to a certain extent, that has a righteousness to it, because you are supposed to try to get to improve those people around you. The verse requires, you are required to surely rebuke your fellow. Again, there are particulars there as well. It has to be someone who will probably listen to you, someone who is on your level, that one who is with you in Torah and mitzvahs. That's why it's called your fellow, as opposed to someone else. It could be called your brother, could be called a different person, whatever. Amisecha means someone who is like with you. But in the case where Joseph saw that they were not going to listen to him, arguably he should have stopped. Now, the beginning of that verse, heicheach toichiach, the doubled language, is usually on the simple level rendered as you shall surely rebuke. Otherwise, there's no explanation for the redundancy in the verb. But the sages explain, heicheach teichiach afilu mea pa'amim. Even 100 times. You should rebuke him even 100 times. In other words, even if it's not working, if you have a genuine expectation that it should work for the second time, do it again. For the third time, do it a third time. For the 50th time, for 100 times, however many times it takes, because you have a genuine expectation that he will listen to you. You're seeing that he's doing something wrong. You should rebuke him. So, from one perspective, Joseph was not successful in getting them to change their behavior to what he thought was right. Remember, there was that duality of perspective, whether they were Jewish and obligated just in the 7 Noahide laws, or Jewish and already obligated in the mitzvahs of the Torah. So he would tell their father, they're doing this and this that's wrong. And they didn't change their behavior. On the one hand, he might have said, look, I know that they're righteous. My brothers want to do what's right. Therefore, I have a genuine expectation that they're going to listen to me, even if it's not the first time that I'm rebuking them, even if it's not the second time, even if it's the 100th time, because even 100 times I should rebuke them. So he continued to rebuke them. On the other hand, they were not listening, and so there might have been the proper perspective that he should stop. And if he doesn't stop, that's already not trying to rebuke them to make them better, but just to make their reputation bad, what's called meitzi shemra, to literally bring a bad name onto a person. And the reality is that according to the 7 Noahide laws, meitzi shemra, this prohibition is on pain of death. So when they, the brothers, adjudicate him because of that aspect of their relationship, they actually have a halachic basis as to wanting to kill him. It's not what it seems where they're just angry with him and so they just want to kill him. In the middle of the second aliyah, Reuven, however, implored them not to shed blood, advising them instead to cast him into one of the nearby pits. Reuven's plan was to later return and rescue Joseph from the pit. The reason why Reuven doesn't want him dead, at least on the face of things, is because he is the firstborn. He's the firstborn, and therefore, after all is said and done, whatever happens to whomever, he is responsible, right? He's the oldest brother. And so if Joseph is killed, of course they're going to pretend as if he was consumed by a wild animal. They didn't murder him or even put him to death according to the halacha. They're going to tell their father that he accidentally died. All the more so because it's, as it were, an accident. That means that the oldest is responsible, and that's Reuven. So he says, there's no upside in doing that. Let's just throw him into a pit, and whatever happens to him, happens to him. Of course, eventually, he's going to come back. He's not going to tell them that. So they think, okay, we're not going to actively kill him. We're just going to passively kill him, drop him into the pit in the desert. He's going to, die of thirst, and done. Continuing in the third aliyah. Joseph arrived, and his brothers immediately stripped him of his fancy robe and cast him into a pit. The pit, our verse says, "V'haboir reik," and the pit was empty. Ein bei mayim, it doesn't have any water. If it's empty, obviously it doesn't have any water. So why is the verse telling me it doesn't have any water? There is no such thing as redundancy in Torah. No such thing as an extra word. In this case, we have a few extra words, not even an extra letter. So it has to be that there's something else that the verse is telling us. And there is. The sages tell us, and Rashi brings this again in his commentary, which means it's the simple meaning of the verse. Mayim ein boy. There is no water in the pit. That's what the verse says. Ein boy mayim. But what does it have? It has scorpions and snakes. Animals that are prominent when there is no water, namely animals of the desert. So when the verse says that the pit is empty, it means that it's empty of water, but not empty completely. Therefore, the second clause, which particularizes what does it not have, how is it empty, it doesn't have water. The scorpions and the snakes, it does have. The Talmud asks, so how is it that Joseph survived? Right? He gets dropped into a pit with no water, but with plenty of snakes and scorpions. Why didn't they kill him? Why didn't they eat him or sting him or whatever, however he would have died? So the Talmud answers that he fell on top of them and always remained on top of them. In other words, he was never on their level, and so they didn't strike. He was always on top of them. Everything in the Torah, in addition to being a narrative, is also a lesson for us. The word Torah is related to the word Hayra, which means lesson. Furthermore, the behaviors, the activities, the endeavors of our forefathers, and that doesn't just mean Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it means in general the protagonists of Jewish history, is a siman labanim, is an indicator, a lesson for the children, for us. The idea of the pit is actually related to the mind. A person's mind never really stops working. The soul has three ways of expressing itself, what are called the vestments or garments of the soul, what are called levushei hanefesh. Three ways that a person expresses himself. He thinks, he speaks, and he acts. Certainly a person can stop acting. You just sit there and don't do anything. Most people can stop speaking. Rabbis, more difficult than others, but even rabbis can stop speaking. A person, however, can never stop thinking. A person is always thinking. You can change what you're thinking about to something else, but you can't really stop that particular vestment, that garment from working. So it's like this bottomless pit that's always has something in it. If ein boy mayim, if there is no water, which is Torah, in the mind, what replaces it? The pit is empty of water. My main boy, there's no water, but what are there? Snakes and scorpions, which relate to what are called machshavas zares, foreign or not good thoughts. Thoughts about things that one shouldn't be thinking about and certainly not doing. If one is in a situation, nobody's perfect, if one is in a situation where haboir reik ein boy mayim, where his mind, his pit, is empty. It doesn't have any water. Joseph gets thrown into such a situation. If one finds oneself in such a situation, how can one escape the damage that the snakes and the scorpions, the foreign and not good thoughts can do to you? You must stay above them. Do not engage in those foreign thoughts thinking that you can defeat them, that you can outsmart them. They are the machinations of the evil inclination, of the Yetzer Hara. And the only thing that one should do, the only thing one can do, is to stay above them. And by virtue of staying above them and not engaging, they will go away just like they did not harm Joseph. Upon Judah's advice, they subsequently sold him to an Ishmaelite caravan traveling to Egypt, who in turn sold him as a slave to Potiphar, Pharaoh's chief butcher. Now, we have here a skip. We went from Reuven, who said, let's throw him into a pit and not kill him, and we now all of a sudden hear what Judah has to say. But Judah is not the second youngest, or second oldest, I should say, brother. Remember, Reuven is the oldest, then comes Shimon and Levi, and then comes Yehuda. As much as in our day and age, when you have children, siblings who are together, there's no distinction about who's a little bit older, who's a little bit younger. Everybody is in the same place, everybody can speak to everybody. The idea that Yehuda would be speaking, Shimon and Levi are not mentioned, is because Shimon and Levi want to kill Joseph. If you remember from last week's Torah portion, Shimon and Levi were the ones who killed by righteous judgment, based on halacha, who killed the inhabitants of the city of Shechem. By that same standard, they want to put to death Joseph because he besmirched their name. But because Reuven said, we're not going to actively kill him, their opinion is set aside because Reuven is their older brother. So Reuven demanding and getting the highest level of respect, being the oldest brother, Shimon and Levi's opinion of putting to death Joseph goes away. The next open person to be able to say anything is Judah. And Judah, therefore, is the one who we hear from about selling Joseph to the caravan. Meanwhile, the brothers dipped Joseph's robe into blood and showed it to Jacob, who assumed that Joseph was devoured by a wild beast. Jacob then commenced 22 years of mourning for his beloved son. The sages tell us that mourning has a very particular appearance, a very particular rubric. When a person first finds out that a close relative has passed away, before that relative is buried, there is one particular status of not even, on the one hand, the deepest kind of mourning, but it's not yet a practice of mourning. It's called aninus. Aninus is when a person is involved exclusively with bringing that close relative to burial. Then we start what's called Shiva, which we're all familiar with, unfortunately, sitting for 7 days after the burial of a close relative. For 7 days, one sits, doesn't do work, doesn't shower or cleanse themselves, doesn't care about appearance, he rents his garments, all of those kinds of things. Then there is a 30-day period called Shloshim, which means 30. And if we're talking about for father and mother, there's an entire year up to 11 months, when again there is an even less potent level of mourning. All of this is specifically designed by the sages, of course based on different verses from different places in the Torah, so that a person who has a particular way, every person has a psyche that more or less works the same way, that a person should be able to heal, not to forget, God forbid, but to heal from the loss of a close relative. That's the way that a person kind of operates. Until the burial takes place, he's nowhere able to begin to even heal. Therefore, he doesn't do any of the practices of mourning. He's just focused on getting the person to burial. Once that's behind him, and we know that that's settled, now he has to turn to himself and to begin to mourn. Of course, it starts with the deepest kind of mourning, then a little bit lighter, and then a little bit lighter, and then he's, as it were, done. Again, never forgetting the loss, but having healed from it. The sages are very particular that one is not to violate this particular rubric. One, for example, cannot mourn in this way for someone who is not a close relative, even if they are a very close friend, a colleague, whatever. A particular feeling of mourning that's fine, but this particular design is not for them. Because as close as one might be to such a person, because he is not a close relative, it's not going to work the same way psychologically. By the same token, a person is not allowed to ignore the requirements of those particular segments of mourning, because that's not healing, that's just kind of not dealing with the situation. By the same token, a person is not allowed to extend those segments of mourning. One isn't allowed to do the practices of Shiva for 20 days as opposed to the 7 prescribed days. He's not allowed to do Shloshim for 3 months. He's not allowed to do it. One is certainly not allowed to mourn for 22 years. Why is Jacob doing this? The sages point out that the concept of mourning and that it eventually brings to healing only works when a person has actually passed away. In this case, Joseph has not passed away. The fact that Jacob thinks he has passed away is irrelevant to the fact that spiritually and psychologically that's not what happened. And for that reason, he can't find the typical healing that would occur when a person properly mourns, because there's nobody to really mourn. Hence, he's in this constant state of mourning for 22 years. We'll note that these 22 years isn't a random number. The same amount of time that Jacob himself was away from his parents, 7 years when he first married Leah, when he was supposed to marry Rachel, but really married Leah, then another 7 years to then eventually marry Rachel, then another 6 years to work for a parnasa, all 20 years with Laban, and then he spent 2 more years on the road back from Haran until he got home to his parents. Those 22 years is exactly the same number of years that Joseph, his son, will be kept from him. The commentaries, the sages, ask a very simple question regarding Jacob not realizing that Joseph isn't dead. Yes, he's presented with evidence that seems to make it that he is dead. But Jacob isn't a typical person. Jacob isn't even a typical wise person. Jacob is a righteous person. Jacob is a prophet. The forefathers were prophets. God speaks to Jacob. He's a prophet. How in the world could Jacob not understand that Joseph wasn't dead? At least from the simple fact that he was in a state of mourning for 22 years, and we just explained that mourning should have healed him. The fact that he wasn't healed should have rung some bells. The brothers made a chedem. The brothers made a spiritual agreement that anyone who divulged the secret that Joseph was not dead, but rather sold down to Egypt, was going to be excommunicated. They included in that chedem Hashem himself. And the reason is, in order to make a chedem, you need 10 people. Jacob has 12 sons. Joseph is sold, so that's 11. Benjamin, his youngest son, the one that was born just as Rachel, his beloved wife, was passing away, she died in childbirth, he remains with his father always. So now we're down to 10. Reuven wasn't there. Remember, Reuven wants to come back later and rescue Joseph from the pit. Where is Reuven? Every one of the brothers had a cycle, had a turn, that it was their turn to be with their father, to help him with whatever it is that he needed, what's called Leshamesh es Aviv, to serve his father. So Reuven wasn't there. That means we're down to 9. You need one more. That was the Shekhinah, the divine presence, that partnered with the other 9 brothers to make this agreement. It is necessary that Joseph be sold down to Egypt, because eventually the entirety of the Jewish people have to go down to Egypt in order to have what was foretold to Abraham at the covenant between the parts, that your progeny will be enslaved in a nation that is not theirs, in a land that is not theirs, and eventually will come out with a great reward, with a great wealth. Berechush Gadol. That can only happen, that descent can only happen with this story of Joseph being sold down into Egypt. That's also why Jacob, who again isn't just a good guy, he's a righteous person, he's a wise person, he's a prophet, he's the leader of the generation. How could he violate Parenting 101 to show, not feel, sometimes you can't control your feelings, though tzaddikim libam b'rishusam, the righteous, their hearts are in their control, and therefore even as a righteous person he should be able to control his feelings. Nevertheless, feelings aside, to show outward favoritism, is fundamentally wrong according to any parental standard. How can he do this? But it's only because he does that there is the possibility for the eventual descent of the Jewish people into Egypt, for their eventual ascent all the way until Sinai and all the way into the land of Israel. So it's all designed by God that it should be this way. Therefore, Jacob himself is not told by God, even though he's a prophet and should have insight, that Joseph is not dead, but rather sold down to Egypt. Furthermore, Isaac, who's still alive, and of course still a prophet, he knows. He, being a prophet, knows what happened to Joseph. But he doesn't tell his son either. Why does he not tell his son? He says very simply, if God is not willing to tell him, who am I to tell him? And so in this regard, Jacob remains in mourning for 22 years. Continuing in the fourth aliyah. The story of Joseph interrupted by the episode of Judah and Tamar. Judah married the daughter of a local businessman and had 3 sons. His first son, Er, married a woman named Tamar, but died soon thereafter. Judah had his second son, Onan, marry Tamar, and thus fulfilled the mitzvah of Yibum, which is called levirate marriage. Basically, when a couple are married and they don't have any children, and the husband passes away, if he has brothers, the oldest of the remaining brothers should marry that widow, his brother's wife, so that the child that's born from that new union should be a continuation of the legacy of that deceased older brother. But he too died childless. Judah hesitated to give his third son to Tamar because, look, something's fishy's going on over here. You have already 2 people that are married to this woman and they died. So she returned to her father's home. Judah's wife then died and he embarked on a business trip. Tamar dressed herself like a prostitute and sat by the side of the road. Judah didn't recognize her, was intimate with her, and she becomes pregnant. A few months later, when her pregnancy became evident, Judah ordered her executed for harlotry. The entire episode doesn't seem to make any sense. How is it that he didn't recognize her? Why would she get dressed in this way? How in the world is he righteous if this is all happening? Remember, all of the sons of Jacob are righteous, Judah included. The reality is that it was prophesied to Tamar that she would have a child with Judah, or from Judah. Therefore, she married his son, thinking that it was from Er. When that didn't work out, thinking that it would be from Onan. When that didn't work out, she thought it would be from the third son. In this regard, she saw that he wasn't being given to her as a husband, and so she said, okay, it must be from Judah himself. The fact that he didn't recognize her, even though she was his daughter-in-law twice over, is because she was so righteous and so modest in the home of Judah that she always had her face veiled, an extra level of tznius, of modesty that even isn't technically required, that he didn't even recognize her. So that when he saw her, he thought that she was just another person. As she was being taken out to die, she produced some of Judah's personal effects that he had left behind when he visited her. She said, better that this person not be embarrassed, even if it means me being put to death. So if he recognizes these things and admits that in fact he's the father, and this was all correctly done, then fine. If he doesn't admit, better that he not be embarrassed. I'm not going to call him out by name, even if it means me being thrown into a fiery pit. Judah admitted that he was the father, and Tamar was spared. Tamar then gave birth to 2 twin sons, Zerach and Peretz. From Peretz comes the antecedents. He is the antecedent of Mashiach. And so in that regard, we see furthermore that this entire union and the 2 children that it produced was righteous. The fifth aliyah. We return to the story of Joseph, who was serving in the home of Potiphar. God was with Joseph, and he succeeded in all his endeavors. God was with Joseph because Joseph always mentioned God. The verse says that his master, Potiphar, saw that God was with him, and our sages tell us that that was because Shem Shamayim Haya Shagur Befiv. The name of heaven, meaning God's name, was always in his mouth. Whenever he would do something and it would be successful, he would say, oh, Baruch Hashem, bless God, thank God. And so even an idolatrous Potiphar, Egyptians back then weren't, monotheists, they were idolaters. Even he recognizes, wow, there's a God, one God, and he is blessing Joseph. Therefore, when that was recognized, the verse says that everything that he does, God makes it successful in his hand. Now, there's a second episode a little bit later in the Parsha where God also makes things successful in Joseph's hand when he is in prison. There, however, Hashem makes it so successful, the verse just says, Hashem matzliach. It doesn't say in his hand. When Joseph was in the house of Potiphar, it appeared as if he was successful. He, in turn, blessed God, and then God's intervention, God's involvement was recognized. In the scenario of jail, it was so obvious that God was involved that we don't even have the concept that it was because of Joseph's hand. Therefore, the verse says, Hashem matzliach, without saying the word biyodoi, in his hand. In jail is worse than as a servant to Potiphar. Again, being sold to Egypt is already not good, but worse, certainly, to be imprisoned. Why in the world would there, in that setting, would there be a greater show of Hashem's presence, of Hashem's involvement? The reality, of course, is that when we have a descent, it's for the purpose of an ascent. And the less we seem to involve ourselves, the more we get out of our own way, the more Hashem fills in the void, fills in the blank. So when a person is in jail, obviously he's less autonomous than even when he's a servant. And so there, in that particular setting, it's just Hashem matzliach. There is no Joseph's hand to even be had. It's open divine intervention. When Potiphar took note of this fact, he put Joseph in charge of his entire household and estate. Continuing in the 6th aliyah. Joseph was exceedingly handsome, and Potiphar's wife was attracted to him. She made many advances on him, but he steadfastly rebuffed her. The fact that the juxtaposition occurs between Potiphar's wife and Tamar, the whole story with Judah and Tamar that we just learned, is because both of the women were told by God, had divine prophecy, that they were to have children from this particular man. Tamar from Judah, and Potiphar's wife from Joseph. Except that Potiphar's wife herself didn't have those children. Rather, Joseph ends up marrying Osnat. Osnat bas Potifera. Osnat bas Potifera is the daughter of Potiphar's wife. And so, at least on the simple level, never mind the Midrashim. So, on that level, Potiphar's wife actually is, even though she's going about it maybe the wrong way, is doing what she knows from Hashem should be the case. Eventually, she libelously told her husband that Joseph was making advances on her, and Potiphar had Joseph thrown into prison. God was still with Joseph, and he found favor in the eyes of the prison warden, who put him in charge of all the prisoners. The 7th aliyah. 2 of Pharaoh's officers, his butler and baker, aroused the royal ire and were cast into prison, the same one that Joseph was now administering. The butler had given Pharaoh a goblet of wine with a fly in it. The baker had given Pharaoh a loaf of bread with a stone in it. One night, they both had odd dreams, and Joseph interpreted them. Not only did they have odd dreams, but in addition to dreaming their own dream, the message that God was giving them, they dreamed the proper interpretation of their fellow's dreams. So the butler, for example, got his dream, which is his meaning for him, plus the proper interpretation of the baker's dream, and vice versa. So when Joseph comes to interpret the butler's dream, the baker says, hey, the verse says that the baker saw that Kitev Pasar, that Joseph properly or correctly interpreted. How did he know? He's not an interpreter of dreams, but because each man got the meaning of the fellow's dream as well, the baker, hearing Joseph properly interpret the butler's dream, also said, hey, I want him to interpret my dream. Joseph told the butler that he'd soon be released and restored to Pharaoh's service. The baker was told by Joseph that he would soon be hung. Why the distinction? Both of them did something that was incorrect. You don't hand a person, especially somebody who you're serving, especially a pharaoh, a goblet of wine with a bug, with a fly, and you don't hand him a loaf of bread with a stone. Seemingly, either both of them should be forgiven, or both of them should be put to death. But the reality is that the baker was either purposely put the stone into the bread, or he he was completely incompetent in his responsibilities. It's impossible to knead dough and bake a loaf of bread not realizing that a stone is in the dough. It's physically impossible unless you don't care or you put the stone in there on purpose. It's quite possible that as the butler is giving the goblet of wine to Pharaoh, that the fly comes in at that moment into the goblet. Therefore, it's quite realistic that he wasn't in any way purposely doing this, and not even irresponsible in his behavior and his responsibilities. Therefore, the butler is saved, is forgiven and released. The baker is hung. Joseph pleaded with the butler to mention his plight to Pharaoh and asked for his release. 3 days later, both of Joseph's interpretations came true, but the butler forgot all about Joseph.